they start in the circles of people who rely upon evidence for forming their opinions rather than people who rely upon lies and prejudices. And Kieran has hooked up with a couple of other fellas to launch a rather splendid podcast, Three Blokes in a Pub. And one of them is Graham Hughes, who rang in last week by coincidence, actually. And it was only when he mentioned, and I get the impression, Graham, that you mentioned it rather a lot, that he's the only person to have visited every country in the world without flying, that I realised he's the same bloke that's on with Kieran. So let's start with the cast list, Graham. It's you, Graham Hughes. It's Kieran, the van driver, Kieran Donnelly. Who's the other fella, the really clever one?
Jason J. Hunter. He's a guy who's he has lived in 12 different countries. He has negotiated on behalf of the Hong Kong government. He knows about trade deals. He's organised.
Yeah, but he won't know as much as Nadine Dorries does, though, will he? He's only actually done it.
No one knows as much as Nadine.
No, that's right. I just want to get that clear from the start. So the three of you have hooked up. First of all, how did you meet? I thought I discovered Kieran. It turns out he had tentacles extending into all sorts of areas of public policy already.
Well, I've been quite involved in the anti-Brexit movement since the beginning, and there's only a few of us, to be honest with you, driving these events, and we're all turning up to places on the mega bus and getting places really early so we can do these rallies and marches and things like that. And it's all grassroots, it's all crowdfunding to get things off the ground, and everyone's saying, "Oh, you're being funded by the EU, you're being funded by George Soros," and we're like, "We wish."
Welcome to my world, mate. If I tell you what, if I had £1 for everyone that told me I was being funded by George Soros, I might as well have been funded by George Soros.
George Soros, exactly.
So where did the idea for the podcast come from then?
Well, what I wanted to do is this thing of, we're tired of experts, we're sick of hearing of experts. We only listen to the bloke down the pub.
Yes.
And I think there was a News Trump article, that was the headline. And I thought, well, why don't we just go down the pub and have three people talking and having a chat about the consequences of Brexit? So we're planning to do different themes, so around the same thing. The first episode, which I don't know if you've had the chance to watch, but it was about no deal Brexit. So the absolute cluster problem of leaving the EU without a deal and what it's going to be like on day one. We're meeting up again today. I don't know if Kieran can make it, actually, so we're hoping he can.
He's a very busy man. He's got a lot of work to do.
Might be two blokes in the pub. Well, the thing is, it's quite funny, is we both have beers. Me and Jason have beers, but Kieran was driving.
I know.
He's working.
He always is. I worry about him. Seriously.
He works hard.
So people listening to this now, for reasons I don't fully understand. Stop talking over me when I'm talking over you. For reasons I don't fully understand, I have an incredibly committed cabal of listeners who are furiously in favour of Brexit and still are, despite all of the evidence to the contrary. What possible reasons could you give them, given that 2 years of listening to me hasn't persuaded them of the error of their ways? They've still got their heads up their backsides. What possible reason could you give them for listening to you?
I think the most devastating thing that people need to sort of understand is that we're going to talk about this later today in the podcast, but the fantasy world Brexit, and the EU gave us everything Rees-Mogg wanted, everything. And we went to World Trade Organization, and everyone said, yes, you can have these new tariffs, you can have these new schedules, everything is perfect.
Yes.
The problem is just the fact that we won't have freedom of movement in Europe. Us Brits won't. We won't be able to live, retire, set up a business, build a house, etc. in these countries. Means that our economy is going to take a hit. The government says it's going to be between 3 and 5%. That's with a perfect deal. So in order to make up for that, we need to increase our trade with the rest of the world. That sounds fab at first, because there's 160 countries in the world that aren't part of Europe and the EU, and surely we can trade with them. The scary thing is, I'm going to try and improve your geography here. Do you know how many members of the UN there are?
No.
There's 193. And of them, only 35 are seen by the IMF as advanced economies like our own.
Gosh.
Of them, 27 are in Europe.
Guys, that's really clear. I didn't know that.
Are in the rest of the world. There's none in Africa. There's none in Latin America. There's none in the Caribbean. There's 4 in the whole continent of Asia. They're all far away. take a long time to get to on cargo ships. I travelled the world on cargo ships. You won't believe the amount of fuel that these things burn up.
You should write a book, Graham.
Swimming pools. I have. It's Man of the World. You should buy it. Man of the World. Go to Amazon. Alexa, order it. I'm not saying that on the radio, am I?
Know what you just did. But hang on a minute. I've been following this very closely. People like Bernard Jenkins and John Redwood and Nadine Dorries, they keep telling me that we'll be absolutely fine trading under WTO rules because 80% of the world does that.
Yeah, but 80% of the world is poor. I mean, here's a devastating statistic that when I say this to leavers, the jaws hit the ground. There's 54 or maybe 55 countries in Africa, if you include Western Sahara. The GDP of all of those countries put together, that includes all the gold sold in a year from South Africa, all the diamonds from Botswana, all the oil from Angola, put together is half the GDP of France.
Mm. And
why are we going to sell them? We only make luxury goods. We make goods and services for affluent people. There's not a farmer in Chad who really needs financial services from someone in Canary Wharf.
All right, Chuckles. Is there any good news?
Well, I can't see how it could happen. Well,
what about all the countries that don't have any? What about all those countries that don't have trading agreements? Because when we come out at the end of March of next year, we'll have absolutely no trading agreements in place at all. There must be loads of thriving countries. They keep telling us that we'll be fine. There must be loads of thriving countries that don't have any trade agreements in place at all. Can you name a couple?
Someone said Mauritania, but apparently they've got a deal.
They've got preferential trade agreements because, everything but arms.
Yeah.
In other words, they're so poor they can trade tariff-free with the EU as long as it's not guns.
Yeah.
So nothing then. What about the Vatican?
Good news, though, I think the good news is this. I think that people, especially Remainers, are now more prepared to do what we need to do, which is to have that really awkward conversation with our family members, with our colleagues, with our friends who voted to leave and say, look, I'm really scared. I'm scared about my children's future. I'm scared about, 2 months of riots with suspended police leave for 2 months following
that may have been denied, I think. I'll double-check that. I saw it at the weekend. But you're right, have these conversations. And it's important to remember they are with friends and family members, because the other story that broke over the weekend, I saw a piece on Quilliam, not Quilliam, that's Madge's outfit, isn't it? Well, anyway, there was research looking at the numbers of people who voted for it from all classes. Were sort of wealthy Conservative voters in the home counties, and plenty of 1 in 4 graduates, and a third of black and minority ethnic people who voted for Brexit. And that's something that everyone who listens to this program has known for a while. You talk about your friends and your family members who did it, and you still get told that you're sneering at the working classes. So and again, everybody did it. There were people from all walks of life that voted for Brexit. It's just that every thick racist did doesn't mean that everyone who did it is a thick racist.
But if there are enough affluent countries out there for us to trade with, then it might work. But they just aren't. And we can't change other countries. We can't make countries richer in the next few months before we leave. And what people want in a lot of these countries is cheap food, cheap clothing, cheap fuel, cheap mobile phones, none of which we can make. And it's not even the case of something that we could make, because we've got a certain amount of standard of living here, minimum wage. We don't have any natural resources. We import 90% of our liquid natural gas from Qatar. We can't cook without other countries.
Onwards and upwards, Graham. So if people want to watch the podcast, you did another one today. They just go to their usual provider. 3 blokes in the pub.
3 blokes in the pub. It's hopefully we're going to do one a week for the next few weeks. See how it goes.
Well, yeah, keep it.
But we want to kind of keep it cordial and keep it upbeat. One of the things is everyone's getting quite down about it. But one thing to be thankful for: 75% of young people voted to remain. So even if we do come out, we'll be back in a few years.
Yeah, but if we come back in a few years, we'll be back in as members of Schengen and as members of the Euro. Otherwise, we won't be allowed to come back in. But again, that's something that generally gets missed by the Brextremists and the unicornists. Graham Hughes there, thank you. And he did really manage to visit every country in the world without flying by sort of hitching a lift on container ships. And he has written a book about it. So I find out more in all the usual places. That's it for this hour. It's just coming up to 11.